And then I'm gonna say some stuff. I'm gonna open up by saying some stuff about the DAW, because this is one of the DAW signature ones. So the art gallery that I work at.
Okay.
All right, we're live. We're joined this hour by Dina Galo-Whitaker. This is one of the DAW signature series speakers. The DAW Center for the Arts is a not-for-profit based in Pomona, California. We service Pomona and the surrounding area, and now that the world's on the internet, we service the world. So we're really, really thrilled to have to be joined this hour by Dina Galo-Whitaker, who is a author, a scholar of American Indian Studies, and a consultant as well around issues of environmental justice. So we're really, really, really thrilled to be joining you by this hour. Dina, before we get into like your book that has recently come out, and some of your lecturing, let's start at the beginning. Like, how did you get started? How did you get involved in the movement more broadly?
Oh, well, let's see. I don't know. That's not even an easy question to answer. I mean, I just being born and raised like a native person in LA during the termination years, right? In federal Indian policy terms, I consider myself a product of that policy period termination when the goal of the federal government was to move Indian people off their reservations, to then terminate their relationship with those tribes. It was another method of forced assimilation, and my mother had come. She's from the Colville Reservation. She'd come to LA during those years, which is how I came to be born there. So and I also grew up in the period of like the Red Power movement. So I was really influenced by that as a kid, and during the 1970s, and it just I don't know. I started learning I had to really learn my family history, and I learned about the history of the boarding schools, which my grandmother and my uncles had been part of. And but it was really that was a concealed history for a long time. I did not grow up with those stories. I had to seek it out when I went back to the reservation and reconnected with family. And that's when I heard the stories of my uncles and grandmother going to the Indian school, the boarding school at Chemawa in Oregon. And and I had never heard that before. This was in like 1990, 91. This is before we had a really wide or a really, wide recognition of that history. People still really weren't talking about it openly. So when I found out about that, it really explained a lot about the circumstances I'd grown up under, and I was really angry about it. I was like blown away, like I can't believe I didn't know this history, and I vowed at that point to make it my mission to learn the correct history, like to educate myself, and then to, you know, to tell that history in my life. And so the way that I did that was through. I was also a budding artist at that time, as a beadwork artist and leatherwork. So in the same tradition as my ancestors, who were very known for their leather and beadwork, up on the Colville Reservation, and so it just led me into the world of activism. So my activism is really tied up with my art career, with my own personal history, my family history. There's like so it's like a continuum of my own personal life, kind of.
So this kind of series kind of hopefully it's destined for a kind of a wide cross section of society. So not everyone's familiar with some things that you referenced. Can you speak a little bit about what was going on with this termination period that you described earlier? Like, can you expand upon that a little bit?
So the federal government, the United States government has had different uh, philosophies in their approach over the centuries in their approach to Indian people, to tribes, tribal nations. It began with treaties. They made treaties with tribes, and the Europeans came over here and they made treaties for land cessions and for peace. So these treaties had these different functions. And in those times, they worked with Indian people under conditions of mutual sovereignty, of recognition of the nationhood of the tribes. That's when the nations were militarily powerful, and were a threat. They were perceived as a threat. But as the centuries wore on and the population exploded of settler people, Europeans, that balance of power shifted, and the treaties began becoming more aggressive, more forced. Um, of course, there were wars going on at that time. Tribes were resisting that. They did not want to be pushed onto reservations, which is what the treaties did. It created literally reserved lands. And so that went on until about 1871. And then after 1871, you see the shift away from the making of treaties to assimilation. Like their a policy. It was also too expensive to keep fighting in wars, and exterminating. So they decide to, pursue this policy of forcibly assimilating Native people into white culture, which they did in a number of different ways, including, and it really begins legislatively with the Dawes Act in 1887. And the Dawes Act was about allotting reservation lands into individual parcels, or privatization of tribal lands, in order to instill values of private ownership, which tribal people did not have prior to that. So, and then that's when the boarding school period becomes legislated, and children were forced from their homes into these assimilation programs, because that's what they were, to strip them of their tribal cultures and turn them into white people. Kill the Indian and save the man was the motto. And then also later to bestow citizenship on Indians, which happens in 1924. And so this assimilation is really what that lays the groundwork for kind of who we are as Indian people today, like fighting fighting for our autonomy, fighting for our cultures, fighting for who we are, and to save our languages, and to save, what's, to adapt to this modern settler society, and still preserve as much as we can of our cultures and our identities. And so there's these different periods, like it vacillates throughout the 20th century. You have this, this during the 1920s, the so-called progressive era, and you have the era called the Red Progressive Movement, which is, happens during that same time as the mainstream progressive era, in the 1910s, 1920s, and then the 1930s comes along, and then the Depression. But what happens is that the federal government decides, they do the study, they realize that Indian people are living in horrid conditions, they are suffering, they are in, the deepest poverty of anybody else in the US, they're sick. And so the federal government decides that, maybe they need, we need to allow them to be more self-governing, and they'll be better off because it's progressives, and they're decide to have this more sort of liberal approach to the way that they're dealing with Native people, and they passed the Indian Reorganization Act. Now we have a policy that's called generally, though, it's like a reform policy that sort of opens the way up for more, limited tribal self-government, in order for them to become economically self-sufficient. That's really what it's about. It's about, trying to, well, the federal government's always interested in dealing with the Indian problem, and the Indian problem is always economic, among other things. So So that happens, and throughout about the 30s, early 1940s. By the late 1940s, you have another policy or another political shift. You have a more conservative uh, kind of political wind blowing, and the federal government is now starting to say again, we need to deal with the Indian problem. It's still a problem, these Indians, and we need to release you from federal supervision. That's how they frame it. Federal supervision. We're going to liberate you from this burden, this yoke. They actually use that word, the yoke of federal supervision. And so they come up with this policy called termination. They literally to terminate the political relationship of tribes with the federal government, terminate the reservations, terminate their political existence. It's just another form of elimination, right? So we say settler colonialism is a system of elimination, a structure of elimination, um, that can mean physical genocide, and it has meant that, to political elimination and the elimination of cultures and languages and those kinds of things. So that lasts up until the 1960s, this move to move people off their reservations, and they're pressured into doing it. They're actually paid money during this relocation program where they were offered jobs in cities. So it was a push to depopulate the reservations, move Indians into these urban centers, and then they finally assimilate right into the mainstream body politic, and so that's when, as I was referring to before, my mother comes to Los Angeles, and leaves her tribal community up in Washington State, and so during the late 1960s, when we have the civil rights era happening, um, and it catches fire and becomes these ethnic nationalist movements, not just among Black people, but the Chicano movement is happening, the American Indian movement happens, and so it's this broad, this racial and social justice movements that are happening, and so what that does for American Indians is, it just like it does for other people of color, it results in another shift in policy, in federal policy. And the federal government decides that, Native people are saying, you need to honor the treaties. We need to go back to the treaty relationship. This is what our relationship with you has always been. And there's a lot of gains made in this time, and the government does adopt this new policy framework that we now call self-determination, and which we have been in since then. So we recognize that self-determination, our political autonomy, um, sovereignty. Now we use the word sovereignty. That wasn't a word that was used in the early 20th century, but now we do. And sorry, my computer's making all that noise. I don't know how to turn that off.
Oh, it's okay.
Getting all these messages from people, like I can't make that stop. But anyway, so that's where we're at today, and that's how I kind of enter into that, into this movement, like that river that's a social movement for Native people, and it really is about protecting our sovereignty and protecting the integrity of our tribal governments, and because we can never rest assured that it's always going to be um, like this. We have these shifts, like it's a shifting pendulum. It goes back and forth. And just because we have sovereignty and self-determination now as a result of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act of 1975 doesn't mean it's going to be that way forever, because we're in another current moment, since the Trump election, where we're seeing a push back toward termination. So it's really, really dangerous. And we are high on guard. The Supreme Court is always a huge threat. We've had really bad Supreme Court decisions for the last 30 years. We have some really dangerous cases in the court at this very moment, that that can that are very threatening to tribal sovereignty. And so we have to always be vigilant um, to protect what we have, because we still control somewhere between 5 and 7% of the land mass of the United States. And that's what's at stake. It's always about the land. So, um, I know that's a lot of information.
Oh
Like,
no, it's great. I mean, there's a lot of directions to go in from there.
yeah,
But you mentioned this new era with Trump, and I'm interested. I'm kind of interested in that because I think that, I mean, a lot of the horrors we saw in Standing Rock were actually, when Obama was actually president. But there's something about the rhetorical threat of Trump that was really really terrifying. Because I mean, I know, coming from my background, as somebody of Mexican descent, that was just like, oh my God, this is the horrible. Because I have stories of Mexican repatriation in my family, so I mean, it's like that to me was horrifying. But I also, recognize that, like, this is a guy that said that he was trying to get a casino or something, or he's trying to something. He's like, oh, they don't look like Indians to me, right? And that was
right,
that. I mean,
right.
so what? How did you, like, when you see this? How did this appear to you when this
Yeah,
comes to it?
well, I've known who Trump is since 1993 when he made that famous statement.
Yeah,
Um, that's when he was in the casino business, and he had that Atlantic City casino, and it was failing. And the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, or IGRA, was passed in 1988, again as economic development measure for tribes to be self-sustaining. And so it had only been a few years, right? So 5 years of legalized gaming for tribal nations, and that was perceived as a huge threat to him. And so he was working um, actively to try to get that law overturned. And that's when you hear him make that statement in testimony in a congressional session. That's when he says that, well, they don't look like Indians to me, that now infamous statement. So yeah, he's been an enemy to Indian country for a long, long time. So when he became the candidate and then the president, it was all hands on deck, because we know what we're in for on some level. We can't know everything, but we know it's going to be another threat to our sovereignty because we know the source. So and he's galvanized these new conservatives, and these new Republicans are not like the old Republicans, right? These guys, these are not the Reagan Bush conservatives. Compassionate conservatism is out the window. Like, forget that. That's not what we're dealing with anymore. um, they are driven by evangelical Christianity. There's all kinds of problems with that for Native people. And one of the problems with it is that they are very concerned. They're very sort of obsessed with Native people not being seen as having special rights as a racial group, right? So they are fighting on that front to try to minimize or eliminate tribal sovereignty, tribal political power, based on um, what this idea that tribes get special treatment as a racial group, which is unconstitutional. Um, but they are framing it in an incorrect way, And, the law is really clear about that. Centuries of Supreme Court decisions, case law, that's our argument, that we are not and have never been a racial group. We are political groups. We are people with political relationships to the federal government. That is different than racial relationships. But they are one of the threats that we're facing right now is around this law called the Indian Child Welfare Act. And the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978 as a result of, so it's this early on in the policy years of self-determination. There's all these studies being done coming out of American Indian Studies programs. Native people are becoming educated, college educated. And a study, and also some of the activism uncovers some vital information, also things related to, for example, women's reproductive rights violations with forced sterilizations. And that was going on with other women of color too, in the Mexican community and the Black community. Like women of color were being attacked in this way and in these eugenics programs. So like that's one thing that sort of paves the way for this. These studies, so it leads to studies in the federal government that uncovers that Native children had been systematically removed from their families long after the boarding school period, or well, long after that forced boarding school. The boarding schools are still happening. They've changed their face a little bit, but it's still happening. And at the same time, Native kids are being removed from their Native families systematically at a rate of something like 25 to 35%. Happened to my family. My mother had 3 children that were taken from her before I was born. So this then leads to the creation of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is meant to stop that hemorrhage of Indian children from their tribal cultures. And it is about protecting the rights of tribes to maintain those children, and to give strength and rights to Indian people to adopt children in the cases when they need to be adopted, right? So it strengthens the tribe's ability to control what happens to their children. But the Republicans have been against that for a very long time. There has been a very targeted attack on that law for a long time. They see it as a race-based law. There's still this thing of the white man's burden, among evangelical Christians. They still believe, that it's their duty to rescue the poor Indians, and give them the right kinds of life that Indians are incapable of giving them, whatever these justifications that they have. So these are the people who are now kind of in charge and running the country. They have very deep interests in breaking down tribal sovereignty and federal Indian law. And ultimately, I think it's still about, getting the land and dealing with the Indian problem, because, we Indians are always a problem. We are always there as the reminder of the dark, violent history and foundation of this country.
So, well, that sets the context for everything. But so I want to get now into some of your work. So recently you wrote As Long as sorry, I got these noises too. As we got the we got your latest book, as long as the grass grows. But what I'm really excited, what I want to talk about before we get to that, and I'm really excited to talk about that. But what I want to talk about that before that is all the real Indians died off, and 20 other myths that you wrote in conjunction with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So I'm really interested in that book, but I'm also really interested in talk about how did that collaboration come together.
Yeah, and for those who are listening, that's how we met, you and I. We
Yeah.
met at a reading in LA at Skylight Books, and you did you opened for us with a poem. And so that's how you and I come to connect, for those who are curious. Um, yeah, so that book was it was my first book, and with Roxanne, she asked me to write that book. Of course, she had was just it was just a couple years out from her, amazing book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's been so well received and is still just, kicking butt, and being translated into other languages and now being made into a film. Um, and with Raoul Peck, the famous filmmaker, is incorporating her book into a major uh, HBO film about American history, which is going to be incredible. So anyway, she was under contract for this book and felt like she needed a co-author, and so she asked me to write that book with her. She was familiar with my work as a journalist, because I had been writing for Indian Country Today and for other online outlets, and doing news journalism, so and commentary. So she just approached me, and I was like, wow, that's a huge honor to be asked
Yeah.
to by somebody like her, and to write a book like that. I mean, for an author, for somebody who aspires to write, I didn't have to go pound the pavement and, hunt for a publisher or anything. I mean, it was just basically handed to me. And the book proved to be, it was very well received. People still like it. It's being taught pretty widely in high schools and college campuses. And then that led to, actually, the way that the As Long as Grass Grows book came to be was the timing of it happened when Roxanne and I were on book tour, after uh, when All the Real Indians Died Off came out. We had done a national book tour, and we went all over the country for 2 months. We went all the way across the United States and up into the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest and the Northeast. And when that was happening in the fall of 2016 was when Standing Rock was just starting to catch fire. Of course, Standing Rock began, the camps began in April of 2016, but by the time we were on tour, it was really starting to ignite, right, in September, after the dog attacks. And so the more this thing uh, exploded, the more curious our publisher is Beacon Press, and the editors there were really kind of inspired, or that's probably not the best word, but they were really taking notice about what was happening there, just like, because it became an international, um, you know, kind of phenomenon. And they had asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about environmental justice from an American Indian perspective. And I was in it, as it turned out, and they probably already knew this, that my graduate research, my master's thesis topic was about exactly that. I had done this research project that theorized environmental justice from an Indigenous perspective. And so I was kind of a perfect person to write this. And the Standing Rock standoff was a rich, you know, um, experience or site to use as the jumping off point to illustrate all the points that I had made in my research paper.
So chapter 1 is environmental justice theory and its limitation for indigenous people. So kind of lays out right there kind of the direction you're headed at this. So can you tell us a little bit that what are some of what first of all, what is environmental, what is the concept of environmental justice, and then after that, what are those limitations, and what are the limitations there?
Yeah, so environmental justice is really, it's a collection of things. It's activism, uh, it's theory, it's law and policy. And so when you say that term, environmental justice, it can mean a lot of different things. And it doesn't even really, it hasn't even really been a concept until the early 1980s in the US, when you have Black communities in the South who are being targeted for toxic waste dumps. And they fight. They are activists, and they're protecting their neighborhoods, and it leads to these studies by community members and then later the federal government, that uh, they believe that they're being intentionally targeted because of their race, right? Because they're Black communities, because Black people are easy to pick on. And so they developed this concept called environmental racism. And so it's a particular type of racism that targets those kinds of communities because you can pollute them, you can pollute their lands, and which of course always has effects to the health of communities, especially with these really major toxic waste sites. And because you can get away with it, right? You can get away with dumping on disempowered people, because where you would never be able to get away with something like that in Beverly Hills. Like, you would never put a toxic waste dump in Beverly Hills or the west side of LA, because people wouldn't stand for it. So this is a type of racism, and they call environmental racism. And so we start seeing, it becomes a really progressive movement. We have Bill Clinton as the president. He signs an executive order defining what environmental justice means, and which really comes down to, like, the key words are the fair treatment of all without regard to nationality or race. And so it's great on paper, and it sounds really good in some ways, but the problem is that in the courts, I mean, environmental justice law is already, it's hard to prove, right? It's hard to prove environmental harm to begin with. It's a very difficult area of law. And the definition of environmental racism or environmental injustice being hinging on racism is way too limited of a framework for understanding the much broader histories of the United States and settler colonialism. Because for Indigenous people, the entire history of settler colonialism is an environmental injustice. And that's what I show in the book, that the genocide against Indigenous peoples, especially to get to their lands, always is about environmental injustice, especially when we talk about this concept called ecocide, which ecocide parallels genocide. Wherever you have genocide, you have ecocide on some level, especially here in the United States. Even when you don't have active processes of killing, like through military action, by some of the actions of, the best example is uranium mining in the Southwest in the Navajo Nation and other Pueblo communities that are incredibly toxic, because of the legacy of abandoning mines without cleaning them up, which leaves those lands, those mines open, constantly contaminating the lands where these people live, and decades of cancerous, cancers and horrible health effects that are affecting predominantly Indian people. This ecocide being the killing of an ecosystem, right, then becomes a genocidal process. So, environmental justice theory, as we understand it, and the definition doesn't even touch that. And so this is a huge limitation by saying that people are targeted for their skin color is only a small part of the problem for Indian people. It's always about the land. So, so that has to be taken into account. That and the fact that Native people have a very different relationship to land than all other people. And that has to be taken into consideration too, because, we've been systematically dispossessed and removed from our lands. And those lands, I mentioned that, somewhere between 5 and 7% of the land mass is still controlled by Native people, but the rest, the remaining 93 or 95% of those lands are still Native homelands, regardless of who owns them now. They're still Native homelands. And so those lands still contain sacred sites, they contain burials, they contain stories that connect Native people to those places for thousands and thousands of years. And Standing Rock really showed us that, right? That even though this pipeline was going in on, was being installed on lands that are not technically reservation lands, they are still lands that were taken illegally based on these treaty histories. So there's all these, much broader complications of history and settler colonialism that environmental justice has not accounted for. And so that's my approach to the book, and why, what the limitations are. It's all comes down to the erasure, the historical erasure of American accountability for these violent histories and the corruption and theft, land theft.
Definitely. Chapter 4 is food is medicine, water is life. I think so many of these communities that we were talking about are affected by the fact that we talk about like right now in the middle of this pandemic, we see that people are being disproportionately affected, and they say, oh well, there's underlying causes, etc. But I mean, this comes from the fact that we live in like these cancer alleys and we live in these food deserts, right?
Yeah.
But of all communities in the United States, I
And
mean,
the lack of healthcare.
lack of healthcare, yeah. And so I'm thinking of all the communities, though, I mean, the one most impacted by this devastation of diet and devastation of drilling and whatever, probably the Native American. I mean, like that with
Well,
these.
Navajo Nation is a
Yeah.
perfect
So
example.
yeah.
Navajo Nation, 30% of the Navajo Nation doesn't have running water. So you cannot control, and the Navajo Nation now has the highest per capita incidence of COVID of anywhere in the United States. The highest. So disproportionately affected. All people of color are disproportionately affected by this, but the Navajo Nation, again, comes out on top for these incredible health disparity, or negative health indicators. And you can't control a pandemic that relies on relentless cleanliness when you don't even have running water. So
Yeah. So before this crisis, though, I mean, you wrote this book before the crisis. I mean, so can you tell us a little bit about, like just this question of not even the question, it's more like historicizing the fact that diabetes is so rampant and all these things. But I mean, like, this is not the fact that the fact that there's so many health concerns in these native communities is they can't be disconnected from like killing buffalo. They can't be disconnected from like
Yeah.
destroying the land and destroying the way people had fed themselves for thousands of years.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of the genocidal process and why genocide is always environmentally related. The extermination of the buffalo was was a military tactic to contain native peoples by starving them into submission. Right. So it begins with that. Well, it actually goes earlier than that. I mean, this has been going on since at least the 1700s. You have dam building in the Northeast in Maine. There's historical accounts of settlers building a dam in the 1700s in Passamaquoddy territory that is completely interfering with the people's ability to hunt and to fish. And so there's documentation of them complaining about that. Look, you're building these dams and you're interfering with our ability to sustain ourselves. So that's a long time ago. And it goes on and on. It's a recurring theme to where it's finally the attacking of food sources. Well, I mean, even in the 1600s, warfare technology, Roxanne writes about that in her book. As early as the 1600s, the warfare, incredible, bloody, violent warfare, the way that the Europeans settlers had conducted it was scorched earth kinds of tactics, freaking burn the food down, starve them into submission. That's how they did it. And so this has just been the way, as John Grenier says, the first way of war in the United States. And it's full scale war. And it evolves over time, but it always impacts indigenous people's ability to feed themselves. When you interfere with the people's ability to feed themselves, and you're talking about people who had some of the most robust health, our people were more, studies show and indicate that indigenous people here in the US were far more healthy than Europeans were. Europeans had built up immunities to certain diseases because they lived in filth and conditions of filth for a long time. They domesticated animals. They lived in densely populated cities within open sewage and, exposure to all these bacteria and pathogens, which is why they're able to build up the antibodies to some of these diseases that end up killing Native people in the Americas, because we lived with cleanliness. We didn't have to build up those kinds. We understood that you don't live in close conditions with animals like that. You bathe every day. The kind of foods that we ate, we had incredibly diverse diets, and diet diversity is one of the keys to robust health. It's one of the reasons we have some of the problems that we do in the modern world is because our diets are so limited. They're nutritionally deficient. So all of that was taken away through the processes of colonization, and have resulted in these chronic health conditions that we have, like obesity, diabetes, heart conditions, cancer. So of course we're going to be more susceptible to these new kinds of infectious diseases like coronaviruses.
Yeah, and it's a straight line. It's
Yeah.
kind of the point to be made there. Um, yeah, yeah. So so where so let's talk about the I mean like so I mean this is really heavy stuff, but let's talk about like what the success of the book. The book has done really well. It's gotten wider like on a wide audience. So what has it been like to promote these books back to back?
It's been pretty amazing, actually. I mean, these books have not hit the New York Times bestseller list or anything like that, but they've been pretty well received, um, pretty pretty widely acclaimed. They're being read. Um, this current book is being pretty well recognized in the environmental community. It keeps making lists of the most important books in the environmental movement. Just today, we got a notice from that Yes Magazine. Yes Magazine included it. What they did was they republished a list from Teen Vogue. So Teen Vogue did this list a few weeks ago of most important books for climate change activism.
Yeah,
And there was like 11 or 12 books on there, and my book was on that list, and it was in the company of Naomi Klein's book, of David Wallace Wells' book, Greta Thunberg's book, and some others. So I feel like, wow, to be in the company of those kinds of highly recognizable names is a huge honor. So um, yeah, I mean, it's been pretty great. I mean, I feel like it's successful. So I have success as an author, and that's fueling more work. And it's keeping me really busy. I keep, with the recognition, I keep getting asked to be involved in more and more projects, more books, more articles, more peer reviews, more, I mean, on boards. I mean, I'm hammered
yeah.
with all kinds of requests for participation in different kinds of things. So I'm feeling very honored and humbled.
Yeah. So for future audience who may be watching this, the year 2020, Teen Vogue actually was a very radical publication.
Right.
Many people, in case it goes back, in case it goes back, and you're like, yes, I was in Teen Vogue, like,
Right. I mean, for people who don't know,
yeah,
like Teen Vogue, like in the last couple of years, has been doing some badass reporting,
yeah,
like some of the most progressive, um, direct, hard-hitting kinds of publishing. I mean, it's kind of like, how did that happen? Where did that come from? Teen Vogue, like, how did that happen? But they've just done some amazing work in the realm of activism, of progressive activism. And so to be included in that is pretty cool. I had another cool thing that happened a few months back with one article that was done um, on the book was an interview somebody had written about me for the book for Gizmodo.
oh,
you
Gizmodo,
know,
yeah,
Gizmodo,
yeah,
their Earther series, I think it's called. And I actually, Jane Fonda, who does this Fire Drill Fridays thing. Have you seen that? Are you familiar with that?
I know she got arrested a few times recently, but I
Well,
didn't. What
that's right. That's part of that Fire Drill Fridays thing that she started. She moved to Washington D.C. to do this climate activism that uh, because she's using her high profile to bring attention to this issue, and her intention was to get arrested. And so she did that, like on a weekly basis, every Friday, just because she was doing Fire Joe Fridays. So those days that she was getting arrested was on Fridays. Then she moved back. She moved back here to California and is now doing them here in LA. But she saw that Gizmodo article and retweeted it. I was like, wow, Jane Fonda retweeted an article about my book. I love it.
Yeah. So what's next? What's next in what's your next project? What might
Oh
I look
my
forward to?
God. Oh, I have so much stuff coming down the pipe. Um, gosh, there's a new book in the works, looking at, uh, looking at what does it mean to have an ethical relationship to land? What does it mean for, and this comes out of indigenous knowledge. I mean, we are in the sixth mass extinction event. Now we have the threat of pandemics, to add to that list of threats. But if my argument is that sustainability, human sustainability, it's not even about environmental sustainability. It's about human sustainability, because the earth will be fine. The earth will be fine without, it'll probably be better without humans. But if we are to survive as humans, we have to have a different relationship to land and to the environment. And my argument is that indigenous knowledge holds important keys to that sustainability, and science is actually increasingly acknowledging that. And so what this comes down to is a different kind of epistemology or worldview. So that means we have to transcend this this way of being in the world based on endless exploitation of the natural world in capitalism, right? Capitalist exploitation. Um, we have to get beyond that. We have to start understanding our existence in the world as in relation to it, not as dominators of it or exploiters of it. And so the book is going. So that means we have to develop this different. This is a philosophical problem. That's my argument. This is not just an economic problem, not just a scientific problem. This is a philosophical problem. So so the book is going to look at that,
Yeah. Well, yeah.
among
Again,
other things.
in your in this your current book, you have a chapter where you talk about the connection between westward expansion, and the Industrial Revolution, like, and how these things are kind of, they're linked like that. So
Yeah.
the theft of land and the building of factories and the destroying of the sky, ocean, and
Yeah.
whatever are
Yeah. Just
interconnected. Yeah.
putting the land in service to humans, which in and of itself is not a terrible thing, but it's the way that it's been done for a century and a half that's brought us. I mean, here's something, maybe I'll leave you with this thought. Um, this is think of it this way, so as Native people, we have been on the land on the North American continent for a minimum of 15,000 years. Science, if we're going to favor science, knows that we've been here for 15,000 years. We say we have been here since time immemorial. But if you take that 15,000 years, let's say 10,000 years, we'll be even more conservative than that. We'll say 10,000 years. If you map 10,000 years onto one calendar year, right? So 10,000 years equals one calendar year. But when Europeans get here, it was 18 days before the end of the calendar year, right? So in 18 days, European worldviews, philosophies, and use of the land has brought us to the brink of self-destruction. 2 weeks. You guys got here 2 weeks ago, and we are already on the brink of self-destruction. Thank you very much.
Terrible.
That's what needs to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. Well, we've been joined this hour by Dina Whitaker. Very, very thrilled about all the work that you've done and all the work that is to come. So
yeah, thanks, Matt.
thank you
Good
so much.
conversation.